So good to be with everyone here this morning, and I have, I suppose it's the joy and the honor of being able to continue our next week in our series on summer wisdom and getting to talk about wisdom for money, which I know is certainly everyone's favorite topic to discuss in the church, particularly among younger people like myself. And I don't know if this is familiar to you or if you felt like this, but it always felt like, for a lot of us, is that every time someone stands up in front of the church to talk about money and what the Bible says about money, that was code for, hey, we're having a really hard time meeting our budget this year. And maybe you experienced that growing up. Maybe you were taught a healthier view of money than that. And so since I know that this can be a tenuous subject, I thought that I'd maybe start off by discussing another topic that people also love and are really good at talking about in the church, and that's mental health. I got to confess, I'm sorry, I really have to confess, I am terrified that no one's laughing at my jokes because of the masks. Okay, that one was funny. Okay, that's good to know, that it wasn't the masks, it was just that I'm not that funny. So thank you for that. But anyway, to actually take a look at money and mental health, I read an article a bit ago from The Atlantic that was published in the middle of June called The Millennial Mental Health Crisis. And what the writer of this article, whose name is Olga Kazan, what she examines here is the way that millennials are having this serious mental health crisis that even before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, that we saw suicide rates and we saw drug abuse rates spiking amongst millennials in our country. And so the writer of this article, she takes a look at this, and as I read this, I was a little bit taken aback about how many times money came up in this article. Take a look at what she says. She says, lacking the money they need and the idyllic life they crave, millennials experience extremely high levels of anxiety and perfectionism, several therapists told me. They have almost double the rate of anxiety disorders compared to baby boomers, says Nadine Caslow, a psychiatrist and suicide prevention expert at Emory University School of Medicine, who estimates that at least a third of her clients are millennials. The anxiety, depression, perfectionism, and substance use all increase their risk for suicidal thoughts. The competing crises of 2020 are likely to make all of this worse. One study found that graduating into a recession has long-term negative effects on life expectancy into middle age. People who entered the labor market in the recession of the early 80s suffered higher rates of lung cancer, liver disease, and drug overdoses later in life. All right, so here's what Kazan discovered, is that there's this incredibly widespread crisis of mental health issues among the millennial generation. And it's not exclusively tied to money, but a lot of it is. Because for so many millennials, the disparity between the life that they crave and the resources that they have, they just don't line up. And she's seen, and research has shown that entering into economically uncertain times, particularly those we're experiencing right now in light of this pandemic, they have serious adverse physical and mental health effects. Now here's the reason that I bring this all up. Is I think a lot of this results from not only the uncertainty regarding money and resources that young people experience, but that we as the church, we need to recognize the uncertain waters that young people are thrown into. And if we can't provide a better vision and better wisdom for what the role of money is in our lives, then we're just throwing young people into those waters saying, figure out, learn to swim in the deep end. And so what we need to do, whether we're millennials or older or younger, is we need to recognize this reality, and we need to seek to display wisdom for young people as they figure out what is the role of money in my life. And as we take a look at the book of Proverbs, I think actually the wisdom that we find here is fairly simple. That the wisdom that we see for money in Proverbs can be summed up just like this. Don't waste it. Don't withhold it. Don't worship it. The wisdom for money in Proverbs is that simple. Don't waste it. Don't withhold it. Don't worship it. Let's take a look. Proverbs 21, verse 20. Here's what Solomon writes. It says, precious treasure and oil are in a wise man's dwelling, but a foolish man devours it. Precious treasure and oil are in a wise man's dwelling, but a foolish man devours it. Now, notice here, right, as Solomon talks about the difference between the wise person and the foolish person, notice that the difference is not actually found in what they earn, but the difference is actually found in how they use what they earn. In other words, both the wise and the foolish man here, they earn and they acquire treasure and oil. But the difference is that the wise man saves it, he stewards it, he aims to save it and set it aside so that it remains with him, where the foolish man devours it as soon as he gets it. He spends it and it goes out as soon as it hits his account. Right, we see this all the time in our culture, that the thing that is held up for us is that we need to get, we need to acquire so that we can spend on things that make our life look impressive to the world around us. This is the very idea that's patterned into us over and over again by our consumeristic and materialistic culture, that everything that we earn should be spent on ourselves so that we can display the life and the picture of ourselves that we want the world around us to see. The Southern historian by the name of Ted Ownby, he writes a book called American Dreams in Mississippi. And in this book, in sort of the early parts of this book, he actually unpacks the way that the American dream is manifested, not as sort of one sort of cohesive dream, but sort of in four separate but related dreams, one of which he identifies as this idea of the dream of novelty. And he suggests that the dream of novelty is one of the things that shapes our consumeristic culture in our world. Here's how he defines this. He says, for individual consumers, the dream involves a romantic, necessarily unquenchable thirst for the new experiences promised not simply by consumer goods, but by the novelty of progressing from one product to the next. As Colin Campbell has argued, attaching personal fulfillment to the next product one can buy and then the next places consumers in the position of the 19th century romantic, dreaming of something ever more about to be. At its logical extreme, this dream demands constant change and creates hope that today will be better than yesterday and that tomorrow will be even better. It is the economic system and cultural idea of what Martha Wolfstein calls fun morality, which turns the child's fascination with new experiences into a social idea for all ages. This is what the dream of novelty patterns into us. And actually what this dream holds out for us, right, is not this idea that if I have the right things, then I can be content. And then my life will be as I want it to be. But it actually holds out for this idea that the desire for new things is unquenchable. That the only experience that matters is the new and the better and the best experience that I can currently find. And we're always going from one thing to the next, thinking that next thing will provide the better experience. We see how this works in marketing all the time, don't we? Right? That this new product, this new device, this new iPhone will provide a better experience than the one you currently have, even though the one that you currently have works just fine. Or this new car with better features will provide a better commute to work, so you'll be happier, you'll be more engaged in your workplace, you'll be more engaged with your home, right? You need the new thing, the better thing, and then the next thing. Or that this larger, more luxurious home will provide for you a better life than the one you're currently in. And the reality is there's always something more. Inevitably, what is this mentality going to create in us? It's going to create in us a culture of waste, right? Where we're immediately discarding one thing in search of the next thing. Where everything that we earned is immediately spent to get something else, to get something newer, to get an experience that's better. And quite frankly, this reality is only exacerbated by technology. Right? I mean, you think of how connected we are to at least the versions of one another that we want to show of ourselves on social media. What does that do to us? It sends this constant message and tells us that we need to spend in order to keep up our appearance. And when we do this, inevitably, we're going to just end up wasting every single cent, every single thing that we earned. It's all going to be spent to make our lives look better. I love what Lacey Morgan, who's a young woman interviewed in the Atlantic article I cited previously. Here's how she describes social media culture. She says, "We have our blooper reel in our head and everyone else's highlight reel in the palm of our hands." That's the reality that so many of us find ourselves in, is that we need to meet the standard that we see someone else set, failing to recognize that we're only getting the window into their lives that they want us to have, that we're only getting the highlight reel. But all of our mistakes rattle around in our head. I think we can all see the kind of damage this does to our lives, the kind of foolishness that this creates in us, the poor sense of money that this culture is going to pattern into us, that everything we earned ends up being wasted and spent solely on keeping up our own appearances. And I think because the mistakes and the brokenness and the cracks of this are right on the surface, we can very easily criticize it and swing to the other end of the spectrum without recognizing that there's the same mistake to be found on the other end. Because as you read Proverbs, you'll notice that Solomon is just as harsh on those who hoard and withhold their money than he is on those who waste it. Proverbs 22 verse 9 says this, "Whoever has a bountiful eye will be blessed, for he shares his bread with the poor." Now that phrase, a bountiful eye, is sort of a Hebrew idiom for discernment, right? When you think of Jesus talking about the eye being the lamp of the body, right? The eye is sort of this discerning force of the body. And so whoever has a bountiful eye, a good discerning eye, doesn't withhold what he has, doesn't save it to use it on himself, but actually saves it and keeps it so that he can use it as a blessing to others. That's what wise discernment looks like, is that we see what we have given to us to care for those around us. Solomon says elsewhere, Proverbs chapter 28, "Whoever gives to the poor will not want, but he who hides his eyes will get many a curse." Right? Notice that the person here who is blessed is not the person who hoards or withholds, but the person who gives and uses what he has to care for others. But rather the person who hides their eyes, that foolish, undiscerning person who hoards and withholds, that person will actually receive a curse. Now I want to be very, very clear here that the scriptures here, Proverbs is not condemning wise saving. What Proverbs is condemning is selfish saving. The kind of saving that causes us to see what we have as this sort of shield of protection around us, that causes us to withhold it and cling to it and grow tight-fisted with what we have. And we see here in Proverbs that this kind of view of money, this sort of hoarding and withholding our possessions and our income, is actually just as harmful as wasting it. Because this sort of tight-fistedness, what it inevitably ends up doing is it always and constantly sets us against our neighbor. Right? That money always becomes this thing that comes between us. That I can't spare a cent at my own expense to care for that other person. Inevitably, we're going to end up turning our backs on them. Listen to what St. Catherine of Siena says in the 6th century, a word that sounds incredibly prophetic in 2020. She says, "The gate is broad that leads to eternal damnation. And blind as they are, it seems they do not see their own destruction, for even in this life, they have a foretaste of hell. They're always suffering because they're wanting more than they can have. They suffer over what they do not have, and what they lose with grief. Their grief is as great as was their love in possessing. They lose all affection for their neighbors and have no care for acquiring virtue. What does this culture of wanting and withholding do to us? St. Catherine says that it actually brings a foretaste of hell into the present. Right? If you could think about everything that the church does is about bringing a foretaste of heaven right now into the present, that this culture of wanting, withholding, of needing to acquire and defend ourselves with our money brings about the very opposite of what God's people are called to bring about. And what ends up happening is we end up suffering over what we don't have rather than enjoying the gifts that we do have. And anything we lose is lost, and it brings about pain. And that inevitably ends up resulting in us turning our backs on our neighbor. On forgetting that the greatest commandment is to love God, and the second is to love our neighbors as ourselves. You see, here's the problem with both wasting our money and withholding our money and hoarding it, is both of them tend to view money as the ultimate, as the greatest thing in all of life, the greatest prize, the greatest treasure we could possibly have. There's a phrase that in our home we try to teach to our children, and it's just simply this. And I wish I could say it was original, but I actually just stole it from a seminary professor. But it's just a simple phrase: toys are tools for playing with people. Toys are tools for playing with people. Right? My daughter sitting here in the front row, she hopefully could recite that for you. Toys are tools for playing with people. And this comes out pretty frequently anytime our daughter and her 2-year-old brother are grabbing the opposite ends of the toy and pulling it in opposite directions, screaming at one another, until one of them inevitably slips off of it and hurts themselves. And when that happens, when these arguments arise, we always have to pause and remember, say, hey, what are our toys for? Toys aren't intended to be the ultimate. Toys are tools for playing with people. Toys are gifts intended to facilitate relationships. The toy, the possession, is not the ultimate. The relationship is the higher priority. And I desperately hope that my children grow up remembering that truth, but the reality is I need to hear that as often as they do, probably even more. That money and possessions and having this perfect image of myself that I would like to project is not the ultimate. But the relationships in my life are the greater priority, and money and possessions are intended to be there to facilitate relationships. Because seeing our money as possession, or our money and possessions as the ultimate, will inevitably lead us to idolatry. It will inevitably lead us to worship money above all else. Listen to what Solomon says in Proverbs chapter 30. It says, "Remove far from me falsehood and lying. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, 'Who is the Lord?' Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God." Notice here as Solomon examines the reality of money and possessions in our life, notice he doesn't denounce them entirely. But neither does he proclaim that we should be trying to hoard them or keep them or cling to them. But what he longs for is contentment, to have simply what he needs, because he recognizes that both the rich man and the poor man can just as easily make an idol out of money. That the rich man may look at all that he has and says, "Who needs God?" And the poor man may be in his poverty, be led to sin and turn away from God. Solomon points people toward contentment with what they have, so that we might see what we have as a gift from God. Proverbs chapter 3, he says, "Honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine. See, Solomon says that whatever you have, whether that wealth is great or small, the call that we have as God's people is to honor our God with our wealth. To honor our God with our money and our possessions, those things that He has given to us. And He connects this to the practice of the tithe. That giving a first fruits of all your produce, this is the biblical practice where what they would do is they would take that first harvest from their fields, and they wouldn't use it on themselves to take care of themselves, but what they would do is they would take the first of what they gathered and they would give it as an offering to God. As a way of saying, God, I want to trust in you, the provider, not in this thing, the provision. That's what the tithe is all about. It's this intentional practice to break us of our idolatry of money. To break us of trusting in the provision rather than the provider. And so Solomon says, honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of your produce. Give to God the first fruit of everything that you earn, not as a way of earning His favor, but as a reality and an acknowledgement of the one who has given you everything. Because rightly holding our money, wisdom for money, is not found in either hoarding or denouncing wealth. It's found in honoring God with it, and about seeking simplicity and contentment with what we have. The theologian Richard Foster, he writes this. He says, without simplicity, we will either capitulate to the mammon spirit of this present evil age, or we will fall into an unchristian, legalistic asceticism. Both lead to idolatry. Both are spiritually lethal. The path forward for us is not denouncement of wealth or hoarding it, but simplicity and contentment in it. Now, I can stand up here and I can talk about just how important simplicity is, how important generosity is, how important contentment is. But here's what I've come to recognize in myself and in the world around me, is that there's no amount of right thinking that will cause us to see our money and use our money rightly. Because that love of money is powerful. And the only thing that can break our love of money and wealth and possessions is if we can find a greater love. Because after all, as St. Augustine says, when we ask whether someone is a good man, we are not asking what he believes or hopes, but what he loves. And so what we need to break our idolatry of money is to find a greater and better love. We see powerfully how this works in the life of Jacob. In Genesis 29, Jacob has run from his family because he was a swindler and a cheat. He swindled his brother out of his birthright and his father's blessing. And now he's running for his life, and he's taken shelter in the home of his uncle Laban. And as he's there, he sees his cousin Rachel, and she's beautiful, and he falls in love with her. And I know that sounds really weird to us right now, but it's actually fairly common practice in the ancient Near East to marry someone who was a closer family relative. And so he works out this agreement with his uncle, this man who was a swindler, always seeking to turn things in his favor financially. He works out this agreement where he will work for his uncle for free for 7 years in exchange for being able to marry Rachel. And listen to what this does to Jacob. Genesis 29, verse 20. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. Jacob is able to work and labor for 7 years, and it says it seems like a few days because of the love that he had for Rachel. You see, what you and I need in order to break our love of money and possessions, to destroy that idol, is we need a Rachel. We need a greater, deeper, more beautiful thing, more valuable thing to love. And I wish I had a really clever way of spinning this, but I think you know where I'm going with this. That the only thing that has the power to break our love of money, to break and crush that idol, is the gospel. It is that perfect, wide, all-encompassing love of Jesus. Listen to what Paul says about the love of Jesus in Philippians chapter 2. He says, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped." Jesus was not about grasping after equality with God. Jesus was not about grasping after honor and glory and wealth and riches. The one who is due all honor, all glory, all wealth, and all creation didn't chase after it, but rather he gave it all up. And you know why he did it? So that he could have you. So that he could enter into our world and lay down his life so that you and I and all creation could be brought back to God. Jesus treasured you more than anything else. And so he laid down his very life so that he could claim his treasure. You are his Rachel. And the only thing that has the power to break our love of money is to become more immersed in this love. To become more in awe and more infatuated with this love. The only thing that can break our love of possessions and wealth is the perfect love of Jesus, who gave up everything for us. Let's pray. Gracious God, so often are we given to the love of all things that are not you. God, we ask that you would shatter our idols, shatter our love of money and wealth and possessions. Shatter it with the perfect love of your Son, Jesus, who gave up everything to claim us as his own. God, we ask that you would work this in us by the power of your Spirit, in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.